You think the Black Death was just a tragedy? A sad chapter. Lots of people died. Moving on. That's what they taught you in school. Here's what they didn't teach you. The Black Death killed half of England. 1.5 million people. Dead. In 18 months, and it was the best thing that ever happened to the other half. I'm serious. Because before the plague hit, 9 out of 10 people in England were essentially slaves. Not called slaves, but slaves. They couldn't leave their village, couldn't choose who they worked for, couldn't let their own daughters get married without paying their lord a fee. 300 years of that. 300 years. And every king, every lord, every bishop in England said the same thing. This is God's plan. Stay in your place. Obey. And it worked. Because what were the peasants going to do about it? There were always more of them. Always more desperate, hungry people willing to work for nothing, because the alternative was starvation. The lords had all the power, until the summer of 1348, when a single sailor stepped off a ship in Dorset, and everything changed forever. By the end of this video, you're going to understand what England actually looked like before the plague hit. And it's grim. What the Black Death actually was and how it spread. How the disease accidentally destroyed the entire feudal system. Why the lords panicked and tried to make suffering illegal. The radical priests who told peasants God was on their side. The moment English peasants marched on London and made a king beg. How a bacterium on a rat created the conditions for the modern world. So buckle up, because this is the story of how the worst catastrophe in English history accidentally created everything you take for granted today. And you were never taught any of it. Let's start with the world before 1348, because you need to understand how bad things were before you can understand why the plague changed everything. It is the year 1300. England has a population of about 6 million people. 9 out of 10 of them live in the countryside, and almost all of them are serfs. Not workers. Employees. Serfs. Here's what that actually means. You are born on a piece of land. You work that land your entire life. You cannot leave without your lord's written permission. You cannot grind your grain without using your lord's mill and paying him for it. You cannot bake your bread without using your lord's oven and paying him for it. You cannot let your own daughter get married without paying your lord a fee first. You cannot do anything, go anywhere, own anything. You are legally bound to the earth you were born on. And if you run, if you just leave, you can be hunted down, dragged back, punished by law. This system has a name, the Feudal System, and it has been running for 300 years. Here's how the pyramid works. King at the top owns every single acre of land in England. Below him, barons. They get chunks of land in exchange for military loyalty. Below them, knights, smaller plots, more military service. And at the very bottom, holding up the entire thing, the serfs. They grow the food, they build the buildings, they do every bit of actual work. And in return, they get to stay alive. Barely. Now add religion on top of this, because the Catholic Church doesn't just run the spiritual life of England in 1300. It owns 1/3 of all the land. It runs the courts. It controls education. And it tells the peasants every single week from pulpits across the country, your suffering is God's plan. If you were born a serf, God intended you to be a serf. Rebellion against your Lord is rebellion against God himself. It is the most effective system of social control in human history, and it had been working beautifully for 3 centuries, until it couldn't, because here's the fatal flaw in every system built on keeping people desperate. It only works as long as there are enough desperate people. Remove the desperation, the whole thing collapses. And in the summer of 1348, a ship arrived from France. Let me tell you what this disease actually was, because the biology is what makes everything else make sense. The Black Death was caused by a bacterium called Yersinia pestis. It lives naturally in rodent populations in Central Asia. Fleas carry it, rats carry the fleas, ships carry the rats. By 1347, it had already eaten through Constantinople, Sicily, Italy, France. And in June 1348, one infected sailor steps off a boat in Dorset. Nobody in England knows what's coming. They'd heard rumors from the continent, something terrible moving across Europe. But England is an island. Surely the Channel would protect them. It didn't. Now, The disease could kill you in 3 different ways, each worse than the last. Bubonic plague. The bacterium attacks your lymph nodes. Within days, swellings the size of an egg appear in your groin, your armpits, your neck. They're called buboes, black, putrefying, filled with liquid, agonizing, without treatment, and medieval England had no treatment. 80% of victims die within 5 days. Septicemic plague. The bacterium enters your bloodstream directly. Your blood starts to rot inside your body. Your skin turns black. You bleed from your eyes. Death comes in hours, not days, hours. Pneumonic plague, the worst one. The disease reaches your lungs, goes airborne. 1 cough, 1 sneeze, that's it. And pneumonic plague, 100% mortality rate. Every single person who caught it died. Every single one. Now here's what makes it even more horrifying. Medieval doctors, and I use that word loosely, had zero idea what was happening. They bled patients. They applied hot coals to the buboes trying to burst them. They prescribed herbs, prayer, fasting. They looked at the alignment of the planets. Some carried canes filled with perfume because they thought bad smells caused the disease. Nothing worked, because nothing could work. England in 1348 had no concept of bacteria, no germ theory, no understanding of contagion whatsoever. From Dorset, the plague spread north with terrifying speed. Bristol falls first. Dense, crowded, perfect breeding ground, bodies piling up faster than they could be buried. By autumn 1348, London. London in 1348 is essentially a petri dish, narrow streets packed with people. The Thames is an open sewer. Pigs roam freely eating refuse. The smell of the city can be detected miles away by approaching ships. Into this environment comes the most lethal bacterium in human history. By the time it's done, 30,000 to 40,000 people are dead. Over half the city. Gone. A monk named Henry of Knighton survived and wrote down what he saw. He said, "Many villages and hamlets have now become quite desolate. No one is left in the houses, for the people are dead." He wasn't being dramatic. We have archaeological evidence, villages that just stop in the records, census entries that go blank, property transfers that never happened because there was nobody left to do them. Now the numbers. England before the plague, 4 to 6 million people. England after, 2 to 3 million, up to 60% of England's entire population. Dead. In 18 months. If that happened in England today, that would be 33 million people dead. Every major city gutted. Every institution crippled, and 40% of all priests in some regions dead. The church had to ordain replacements so fast they took anyone. Men who couldn't read, men with no training, men who couldn't explain to their terrified congregations why God was doing this. That detail matters enormously. We're coming back to it. By December 1349, the worst is over. England wakes up, and it doesn't recognize the world it's woken up in. Imagine you're a lord in 1350. You survived. Good for you. You ride back to your estate, and it's empty. The men who plowed your fields, dead. The women who brought in the harvest, dead. The blacksmith, the miller, the carpenter, dead. Half your village, gone. On screen. The crops are rotting in the fields. Nobody left to pick them. Here's the thing about the feudal system. It was built entirely on one assumption, that there would always be more desperate people than available work, always more hungry serfs who had no choice but to accept whatever terms the lord offered. No choice. No leverage. No power. The Black Death destroyed that assumption overnight, and now the lords are staring at empty fields, rotting harvests, no workers. And here's what happens next. Something that had never happened in 300 years of English feudalism. Lords start competing for workers. Competing for serfs. People who 3 years earlier could have been dragged back in chains if they dared to leave their village without permission. Now the lord of the next manor is sending messages. Come work for me. Higher wages, less duties, better conditions. On screen, wages in England rose 20 to 40% in the decade after the Black Death. And it's not just anecdotal. We have account books from manor estates across England showing wages climbing year after year. In some cases, in a single year after the plague, wages jumped 67%. 67% for people who had been earning barely enough to survive. This wasn't just money. This was power. For the first time in their family's entire history, these people had something to negotiate with. They had leverage, the lord's panic. They do what powerful people always do when they feel their power slipping. They call the government. In 1349, 1 year after the plague, King Edward III issues the Ordinance of Laborers. On screen, the Ordinance of Laborers 1349. No worker shall be paid more than pre-plague wages. No lord shall offer more. No serf shall leave their village. Just freeze everything. Pretend none of this happened. In 1351, they double down with the Statute of Laborers. Courts, fines, imprisonment for daring to ask for a pay rise. They made it illegal to pay workers more. Think about that, and here's the beautiful part. It didn't work. Not because people were brave enough to openly defy the king, but because you cannot pass a law against supply and demand. When half your workforce is dead and every lord in the county needs workers, and there simply aren't enough workers to go around, wages rise. No parchment in the world can stop that. The church falls apart. Meanwhile, the church. Remember those replacement priests? The ones ordained in a panic because 40% of the clergy were dead? They can't answer the question everyone is asking. Why did God do this? Because the plague killed devout people and sinners alike. It killed priests and bishops. It killed lords and serfs. It did not care one single bit about your position in the divine order on screen. The plague killed holy men. It killed lords. It did not care who God had supposedly blessed. And when peasants watched their lord die of the same black buboes of the poorest person in the village, the idea that God had planned their servitude, that God had blessed the lords and intended the serfs to serve them, that idea started dying too. There's something historians almost never talk about when it comes to the Black Death: the psychology of the survivors. What does it do to a person to survive something that killed half the people they knew? Contemporary accounts consistently use one specific word to describe survivors: special. The people who survived the Black Death believed, almost universally, that God had specifically chosen to spare them, that God had looked down at England, at all the death, and decided, you survive. And if God specifically decided to spare you on screen, what does that make you worth? A serf who grew up believing God had ordained his poverty and his servitude. That same serf, having watched his lord lose half his family to the same disease, was not the same person anymore. He knew what it felt like to be needed, and he was never going to forget it. Meet Alice. Let me make this real. Her name is Alice. She's in her 30s. She lost her husband and 2 of her 3 children to the plague. She survived. She's working. Her lord's estate is desperately short of workers. The lord of the next manor has sent word, double wages and reduced duties if she comes to him. Before 1348, Alice had no choice. Bound to the land, can't leave. But now her lord knows, if he doesn't offer her better terms, she walks, and he cannot afford to lose her, because there is nobody else. Alice negotiates. Higher wages, fewer duties, freedom to move without asking permission. She buys more food, better food, occasionally meat. She buys better clothing, because with half the population dead, markets are flooded with goods nobody is buying. Prices are falling, just as wages are rising. For the first time in her family's history, Alice is not quite so poor. The ghost villages. But not everywhere, not for everyone. Across England, mostly in the Midlands, there are over 3,000 sites where medieval villages just stopped. Today, you can fly over the English countryside and see their outlines from the air. Ghost streets, raised above the surrounding fields, rectangles where houses once stood, hollow ways where carts once rolled, villages that existed for 500 years. Gone. In a decade, some lords unable to farm without workers switched to sheep. Sheep need far fewer people than grain farming. More sheep meant more wool. More wool meant a boom in the cloth trade. England, which had always exported raw wool, starts producing finished cloth. The ghost villages were a tragedy. The cloth industry was an accidental industrial revolution, 5 centuries before the actual one. By 1360, the immediate devastation is a decade in the past, but the effects are getting more intense, not less, because the lords have spent 10 years trying to put the genie back in the bottle. Wage freezes, legal restrictions, imprisonment, all of it aimed at restoring 1346. But the peasants had tasted something they could never untaste. They knew what leverage felt like. No law could erase that. You can pass a law against rising wages, You cannot pass a law against rising expectations. Into this atmosphere come two men who become the intellectual spark for revolution. John Wycliffe, Oxford theologian, church insider, had every reason to defend the existing order. But Wycliffe had watched the plague, watched the church respond with platitudes while people died, watched the Pope live in luxury while his priests couldn't explain why God was killing children. And Wycliffe reaches a conclusion. The only true religious authority is the Bible itself, not the Pope, not the King, not the Church. In 1370, this is one of the most dangerous ideas in England. Here's why. If the Bible is the only true authority, then every person who can read it can decide for themselves what God wants. And if every person can decide for themselves, then the Church's authority is gone. And if the Church's authority is gone, the entire theological justification for the feudal system is gone. Wycliffe's followers are called the Lollards. They travel the country preaching this message, not in Latin. In English, not to scholars, to peasants. And the peasants were listening. John Ball. If Wycliffe is the intellectual architect, John Ball is the street preacher. No fixed parish, no patrons, no protection, excommunicated, imprisoned multiple times, kept going anyway, because John Ball is asking a question. A simple question. A question the church had spent 3 centuries making sure nobody ever asked. When Adam delved and Eve span, who was then the gentleman? Think about what that actually means. In the beginning, Adam dug the earth, Eve spun the thread. No lords, no serfs, no kings, no church, just labor, human work. So where exactly did all these lords come from? Who decided they deserved to sit in castles while others broke their backs in fields? Was that God's plan? Or was that just men, taking what they wanted and calling it divine? The church called this heresy. The lords called it sedition. The peasants called it the truth, the poll tax. Against all this simmering rage, rising expectations, radical theology, decades of frustrated ambition, the crown decides to levy a new tax. In 1381, the poll tax, every adult in England, every single one, regardless of wealth, same flat fee, not equal in the way John Ball meant. Equal in the worst possible way. A serf earning pennies a week pays the same as a baron earning thousands of pounds a year. It's the 3rd poll tax in 4 years. First one paid with gritted teeth. Second one barely suppressed fury. Third one? Match, powder keg. The Peasants Revolt of 1381 begins simultaneously in 2 places. Kent, led by a man named Wat Tyler, Essex, led by a man named Jack Straw. Both start as local resistance to poll tax collectors. Both escalate with terrifying speed into something nobody had ever seen in England, an organized political revolutionary uprising. June 1381, tens of thousands march on London. This is not a rabble. This is not a mob. This is an army. They free John Ball from prison as they pass through Canterbury. He becomes their chaplain, their conscience, their voice. And as they march, more join them, not just poor rural laborers, craftsmen, tradespeople, minor clergy, lower gentry, everyone below the very top of society, all with the same grievances, all finally willing to say it out loud. Imagine marching on London in 1381. What would you be demanding? Tell me below. On the 12th of June, they reach Blackheath, the hills just south of London, between 10 and 60,000 people. John Ball preaches to them there. He tells them they are the rightful heirs of a world that was stolen from them, that the Norman conquest 300 years earlier was a theft dressed up as divine right, that the time has come to take it back. The following day, they enter London, and London opens its gates to them. London's own dock workers, craftsmen, laborers. They didn't see invaders, they saw allies. Inside the city, the rebels burn the Savoy Palace, most lavish private residence in England, owned by John of Gaunt, the king's uncle, the most powerful man in the land. They burn it to the ground. They burn the records of legal obligations, the documents that said which serfs owed which services to which lords. And here's the detail that absolutely floors historians. They did not loot it. Wat Tyler reportedly executed members of his own force who tried to steal valuables from the ruins. They weren't stealing. They were making a political statement. They knew exactly what they were doing. This wasn't greed. This was the deliberate destruction of the infrastructure of oppression. Richard II is 14 years old. 14. When an army of up to 60,000 people camps outside his capital and demands a meeting, and he rides out to meet them. At Mile End, June 14th, Richard meets Wat Tyler and the rebel leaders, and he makes promises. Abolition of serfdom, right to rent land at fair rates, full pardon for all rebels. The rebels believe him. Many start going home, but Tyler stays. There's more to demand. A second meeting, Smithfield. Something goes wrong. Every account of what happened next was written by people on the Crown's side, so the truth is murky. What we know, a confrontation between Tyler and the mayor of London. Tyler is pulled from his horse, stabbed repeatedly, in full view of the entire rebel army. Bows go up, 60,000 people staring at the murder of their leader. It could have been a massacre. And 14-year-old Richard II does something either incredibly brave or incredibly calculated. He rides toward the army, alone. I am your king and your leader. Follow me. He leads them north, away from London, long enough for his court to regroup. And then, he revokes every single promise he made at Mile End. Villains ye are, and villains ye shall remain. The revolt is crushed, its leaders hunted down. John Ball, captured, tried, executed. On the surface, the old order won. But something had happened that could not be undone. For the first time in English history, ordinary people marched on London, occupied the capital, made a king make promises to them. And the powerful knew it. They'd seen what was possible. And they were never quite as comfortable again. Richard broke every single promise. But did the revolt still change England? What do you think? Drop it below. History doesn't work the way we want it to. Revolutions don't succeed overnight. Change doesn't arrive with one dramatic moment. It grinds, slowly, through 1,000 small acts of stubbornness and negotiation. The Peasants Revolt of 1381 was crushed, but the feudal system it was fighting died anyway, just more slowly, more quietly. Serfdom in England was effectively dead by 1500, not with a bang, but with a century of market forces that no crown could stop. Year by year, the obligations of serfdom were quietly dropped, renegotiated, ignored. Lords who needed labor couldn't afford to enforce the old rules. By the early 1500s, 150 years after the Black Death, serfdom in England had effectively ceased to exist. Not because a king abolished it, not because a revolution succeeded, but because after half the country died, the survivors refused to go back. The Reformation. Remember the theological crisis from earlier? The church's failure to explain the plague, the untrained replacement clergy, the growing sense that God did not distinguish between lord and serf? Those seeds kept growing. Wycliffe's ideas, that every person could have a direct relationship with God without a priest telling them what to think, kept spreading. The Lollards were persecuted, burned alive in some cases. But the ideas could not be unthought. In 1517, 169 years after the Black Death, Martin Luther starts the Protestant Reformation. But England's version, Henry VIII's break with Rome, the Church of England, the dissolution of the monasteries, it has roots that go all the way back to 1348. To a disease that killed so many priests, the church could no longer control what people believed. The English language. One final thing nobody talks about. Before 1348, England is essentially a bilingual country. The ruling class speaks Norman French or Latin. Peasants speak English. English is the language of people who don't matter. Official documents, Latin. Court proceedings, French. The Bible, Latin. Then 40% of the clergy die. Their replacements can only preach in English. The Lollards, deliberately, politically, write and preach in English. Because if you want to reach the people, you speak the people's language. By 1362, just 14 years after the plague, Parliament officially switches from French to English. By 1400, Geoffrey Chaucer writes the Canterbury Tales in the language of ordinary people. The language you are watching this video in right now, the language that eventually becomes the most widely spoken on Earth, has roots that run directly through the Black Death. So let's recap everything we've covered in the last 3 hours. The Black Death killed up to 60% of England's population in 18 months, destroyed the labor surplus that the entire feudal system depended on, forced wages up 20 to 40%. No matter what laws the crown passed, shattered the church's authority by dying in ways its own theology couldn't explain, created a new psychology, survivors who felt chosen, who felt they had worth, who refused to go back, inspired radical theologians who told peasants God spoke to everyone, not just the powerful, sparked the Peasants Revolt, the first time ordinary English people marched on their capital and made a king beg, ended serfdom. Not through one revolution, but through a century of unstoppable market forces. Seeded the Reformation by killing enough priests that the church lost its monopoly on truth. Helped create the English language because the people who replaced dead priests could only speak English. This is not conspiracy theory. This is documented history, but schools don't teach it this way. Because the comfortable version of history says change comes from great leaders and noble decisions. This version says change came from a bacterium, from a flea on a rat on a ship, from the accidental death of half a country, and from the survivors who had tasted what it felt like to be needed, refusing to ever forget it. The Black Death didn't free anyone directly. It didn't write a law. It didn't preach a sermon. It didn't march on London. It just removed the one thing the Lords had always relied on, the assumption that there would always be enough desperate, powerless people to keep the system running. And the people who survived, they never forgot what leverage felt like. If this completely changed how you see history, good. That was the point. Hit the like button if you're angry you weren't taught this in school. Drop a comment. What shocked you the most? Subscribe, because next week I'm covering the story of how England accidentally invented democracy by chopping off a king's head. Spoiler, it's messier than you think. See you there. Cheers.